The wind howled through the trees, rattling the old wooden house as if testing its strength against the elements. The forest stretched for miles in every direction, an unbroken sea of towering pines and thick underbrush. It was the kind of place where silence held weight, where the only sounds came from nature itself. Rustling leaves, distant hoots of owls, the occasional snap of a twig under something heavy. And then there was the bear, started 2 weeks ago. At first, it had been a fleeting glimpse, a shadow moving just beyond the tree line, a heavy presence that made the hairs on the back of Daniel Thompson's neck stand up. He'd seen bears before, of course. Living this far from town, it was inevitable. But this one was different. This one came back. Every night, always to the same window. Daniel sat in his chair by the fireplace, his eyes flicking to the large window that looked out over the front yard. Beyond it, the trees swayed, their branches clawing at the night sky. The glass reflected the dim glow of the fire, distorting the world outside. But he knew the moment he stood and approached, he would see it. The bear, standing motionless at the edge of the yard, staring. He exhaled slowly, running a hand through his graying hair. He had kept it to himself at first, chalking it up to coincidence. But when Sarah, his wife, had woken up to use the bathroom 3 nights ago and gasped loud enough to wake the whole house, the secret was out. She had seen it too. That hulking figure, its dark eyes locked on the window. Daniel had gone outside the next morning, looking for tracks. But the wind had erased any evidence the night visitor had left behind. Still, he knew what he had seen. And he knew the bear wasn't just passing through. It was watching them. He stood with a groan, his knees popping as he walked toward the window. His pulse quickened as he reached the edge of the room, pressing his palm against the cold wood of the wall. He took a breath, steadied himself, then peered out. And there it was, a massive grizzly, its fur thick and shaggy, standing just beyond the porch steps. The silver moonlight highlighted the muscles beneath its coat, the way its chest rose and fell in deep, measured breaths. But it wasn't the size that sent a shiver through Daniel's spine. It was the stillness. The bear didn't move, didn't sniff the air, didn't wander the way wild animals did. It just stood there, watching. Daniel's fingers twitched at his side, his breathing shallow. It was absurd, he knew, to feel unnerved by a bear. But this was something else. It wasn't hunger that kept it coming back. It wasn't curiosity. It was something deeper, something he didn't understand. Is it back? Sarah's voice was soft, barely above a whisper. Daniel didn't turn. He kept his eyes on the bear, his body rigid. Yeah, a pause, a breath. Then the sound of soft footsteps as she moved to his side. He felt her presence before he saw her, the warmth of her arm as it brushed against his. Together, they stood in silence, watching the creature in the yard. Sarah was the first to speak. It looks sad. Daniel frowned, finally turning to her. Sad? She nodded, her eyes still fixed on the bear. Look at its eyes. He did, and as much as he wanted to dismiss it, he couldn't. There was no aggression in the bear's gaze, no wariness, only something that, impossibly, felt like sorrow. Sarah exhaled, wrapping her arms around herself. It's not here to hurt us. Daniel wasn't sure if she was trying to convince him or herself. But the more he looked, the more he felt it too. The bear wasn't a threat. It was waiting, and that realization chilled him more than anything else. Daniel barely slept that night, even after the bear finally disappeared into the trees, swallowed by the darkness. His mind refused to quiet. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the soft, rhythmic breaths of Sarah beside him, feeling the weight of something unspoken pressing on his chest. Why was the bear watching them? What was it waiting for? It wasn't normal behavior, he knew that much. Bears didn't linger around human homes unless they were scavenging for food. But he and Sarah never left anything outside that would attract wildlife. No garbage bins, no leftovers, nothing. And yet, night after night, the bear came, watching, waiting. He rose before the sun, slipping out of bed without waking Sarah. The house was still, filled only with the faint creaks of old wood settling. He pulled on his jacket and boots, grabbed his rifle, not with the intent to use it but for reassurance, and stepped out onto the porch. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. The sky, still smeared with the last traces of night, stretched endless above him. For a long moment, he just stood there, watching the tree line, as if expecting to see the bear's hulking form waiting beyond the shadows. But the forest was quiet, too quiet. Daniel moved cautiously down the steps, his boots crunching against the frost-covered grass. He walked the length of the yard, scanning the ground for any sign that the bear had been there. And sure enough, he found them. Tracks, massive paw prints pressed deep into the soil, leading from the trees to the very spot where the bear had stood the night before. Daniel crouched, running his fingers over the indentations. They were fresh. He followed the tracks, his heart pounding harder with every step. They led him toward the woods, past the porch, past the old oak tree with the tire swing Sarah had begged him to put up years ago. And then, they stopped, abruptly, as if the bear had vanished into thin air. Daniel frowned, scanning the ground for signs of disturbance, but there was nothing. No dragged footprints, no shifting in the earth. Just nothing. His pulse quickened. He wasn't a superstitious man, but something about this felt wrong. A rustling in the trees made him spin, his fingers tightening around the rifle. Silence. Then, a sound. Faint, almost like a whimper. Daniel's breath caught. He turned slowly, listening. Came again, softer this time. A sound that didn't belong to the wind, or the trees, or any animal he had ever heard before. It sounded human. His throat tightened. He took a cautious step toward the noise, then another. His instincts screamed at him to turn back, to let it go, but he pushed forward, drawn by something he couldn't explain. And then he saw it. Half hidden in the underbrush, curled into itself, was a shape. Small, fragile. Daniel's stomach dropped. It was a child, a little girl. Her clothes were tattered, barely more than rags. Her blonde hair tangled with leaves and dirt. Her tiny body trembled, her bare feet scraped and bloody, and her eyes, when she lifted them to look at him, were wide with something beyond fear. She had been crying. For a long time, Daniel's chest ached. "Jesus," he whispered. The girl flinched at his voice, pressing herself deeper into the earth like she was trying to disappear. Daniel immediately raised his hands, lowering himself onto one knee. Hey, it's okay," he said, his voice as gentle as he could make it. "I'm not gonna hurt you." She didn't move, didn't speak, just stared. Daniel's mind raced. Where had she come from? Who was she? How had she survived out here alone? And then, another realization hit him like a punch to the gut. The bear. It had been watching the house for 2 weeks. The girl looked no older than 6 or 7. Could it be? Could the bear have been protecting her? His throat tightened. He took a slow breath, steadying himself. "Are you alone?" he asked softly. The girl hesitated, her tiny fingers gripping the fabric of her ruined dress. Then, slowly, so slowly, she shook her head. Daniel's pulse pounded. "Who's with you?" he asked. She didn't answer. Instead, she lifted a trembling hand and pointed. Daniel followed her gaze, his breath caught in his chest. There, just beyond the trees, half hidden in the mist, stood the bear. Watching, waiting, protecting. Daniel's mind reeled. He had never seen anything like this. Never heard of a wild animal forming such a bond with a human, a child, let alone one it should have considered prey. And yet, the bear hadn't harmed her. It had guarded her, guided her, led her here. Sarah's words from the night before echoed in his mind. It looked sad. Maybe it wasn't sadness. Maybe it was grief. Daniel swallowed hard, turning back to the girl. She was shaking, exhaustion carved into her tiny frame. He knew what he had to do. Slowly, carefully, he reached out his hand. "Come on," he whispered. "Let's get you inside." For a long moment, she didn't move. Then, tentatively, hesitantly, she placed her small fingers in his. Daniel exhaled, relief washing over him as he gently lifted her into his arms. She was light, too light. He turned back toward the house, his steps careful, measured. The bear didn't move, didn't growl, didn't stop him. It just watched. And as Daniel carried the girl inside, he understood. The bear had never been waiting for them. It had been bringing her home. Daniel stepped into the house, cradling the girl's frail body in his arms. The warmth of the cabin hit him immediately, a stark contrast to the crisp morning air outside. The child shivered against him, her small fingers clutching the fabric of his jacket as if afraid he might disappear. Sarah, who had been pouring coffee in the kitchen, turned at the sound of the door opening. Her eyes widened when she saw the girl. "Oh my God," she whispered, nearly dropping the mug. "Daniel, who?" "She was out there," he said, his voice tight. "In the woods." Sarah rushed forward, her hands hovering over the girl as if afraid to touch her, as if she might break. "She's freezing," she murmured, her voice thick with worry. "And look at her. She's so thin." Daniel nodded, his jaw clenching. He didn't need to be told. He could feel how light she was, how her ribs pressed against her fragile skin beneath the tattered dress. Sarah's motherly instincts kicked in immediately. "Come on, sweetheart," she said softly, her voice soothing as she guided Daniel toward the couch. "Let's get you warm, okay?" The girl didn't respond. She hadn't spoken a single word since he found her. She simply allowed herself to be placed on the couch, curling up like a wounded animal. Daniel grabbed a thick blanket from the armchair and draped it over her shoulders. "We need to call someone," he muttered, reaching for his phone. "The sheriff? Child services. Someone has to be looking for her." Sarah hesitated. "Maybe," he frowned. "Maybe." Sarah bit her lip, glancing at the girl, who was staring into the fire, her expression blank. "Daniel, if someone were looking for her, do you really think she'd be out there alone?" The words hit like a gut punch. Daniel exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand over his face. She was right. The girl wasn't just lost. She had been out there for days, maybe even longer. Someone had left her, and the bear had been watching them because of her. Sarah knelt beside the couch, keeping her voice gentle. "Sweetheart, can you tell us your name?" The girl's fingers twisted into the blanket. Silence. Sarah tried again. "Do you know where your parents are?" Still nothing. Sarah exchanged a worried glance with Daniel. "She's in shock." He nodded grimly. Yeah, they needed answers, but forcing them out of a traumatized child wasn't the way to get them. He turned toward the window, his eyes scanning the edge of the trees. The bear was gone. For now. He wasn't sure if that comforted him or unsettled him more. Sarah brushed a strand of matted hair from the girl's face. "She needs a bath, clean clothes, something to eat." She looked up at him. "I'll take care of her. You check outside. Make sure we're alone." Daniel hesitated, then nodded. His gut told him this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Outside, the morning was brighter now, the sun cutting through the trees in golden streaks. Daniel's breath fogged in the air as he stepped off the porch, scanning the woods. The wind had picked up, rustling the leaves, carrying the scent of damp earth and pine. The bear's tracks were still there. So were the girls. Daniel followed them, his boots crunching over fallen leaves and twigs. His mind raced. How long had the bear been with her? Had it been protecting her, feeding her, leading her to them? It was absurd, impossible. And yet, the truth was right in front of him. The girl had survived out here, because of that bear. His hands clenched at his sides. The thought made his stomach turn. Because if the bear had been keeping her safe, then that meant someone or something had been trying to hurt her. A cold dread crept up his spine. Something had driven that child into the wilderness. And whatever it was still out there. Back at the house, Sarah had drawn a warm bath, coaxing the girl into the water. She winced at the bruises along the child's arms, the scrapes on her knees. Some looked fresh, others were older, faded but still visible beneath the grime. Her heart ached. What had this child been through? After the bath, she helped her into a pair of soft pajamas. They were too big, one of Daniel's old flannel shirts cut down to size. But the girl didn't seem to mind. Sarah smiled gently. "You must be hungry." For the first time, the girl responded. She nodded. Sarah's chest tightened. "Okay, sweetheart, let's get you some food." She led her into the kitchen, setting a plate of warm oatmeal in front of her. The girl hesitated only for a second before digging in, shoveling spoonfuls into her mouth like she hadn't eaten in days. Sarah blinked back tears. Daniel walked in a moment later, his expression grim. "She's staying with us," Sarah said firmly before he could speak. He sighed. "Sarah?" "No," she turned to him, her eyes blazing. "We are not calling child services. Not until we know more." Daniel clenched his jaw. He knew that look. Sarah wasn't backing down. His gaze flicked to the girl. She was still eating, oblivious to the conversation happening around her. His shoulders sagged. "All right," he muttered. "For now." Sarah let out a breath, nodding. Daniel sat across from the girl, watching her carefully. "Can you tell us your name, sweetheart?" She paused, her spoon hovering over the bowl. Then, so softly it was almost a whisper, she spoke. "Lily." Sarah smiled. "That's a beautiful name, Lily." Lily didn't smile back. Instead, she lowered her spoon and, for the first time, met Daniel's eyes directly. "They're coming," she said quietly. A chill ran through him. Sarah frowned. "Who, sweetheart?" Lily's grip tightened on the edge of the table. "The bad men." Daniel's breath caught. Sarah's face paled. Lily swallowed hard, her tiny hands trembling. "They took my mommy," she whispered. "And now they're coming for me." Outside, the wind howled, and somewhere deep in the forest, a low, warning growl rumbled through the trees. The bear had returned, because the danger wasn't over. It was just beginning. Daniel felt his pulse hammering against his ribs. The words had barely left Lily's mouth, yet they carried the weight of something far greater. Something dark, something that sent an icy chill through his veins. The bad men. Sarah reached for Lily's trembling hand, her voice gentle but urgent. "Lily, honey, what do you mean? Who took your mommy?" Lily's eyes darted to the window, wide and filled with something that looked far too much like terror for a child her age. She swallowed hard, her voice barely above a whisper. "They took her away in a truck. They had guns." Her fingers clenched into fists on the table. "She told me to run." Daniel exhaled slowly, his mind racing. Someone had taken this child's mother. Someone armed. And if Lily was right, they weren't done hunting. His body tensed, instincts kicking in. "Lily," he said, keeping his voice steady. "When did this happen?" The little girl hesitated, her small fingers gripping the fabric of her too large flannel shirt. "A long time ago." She paused, as if struggling to find the right words. "I don't know. Maybe days?" Daniel and Sarah exchanged a look. Days. The girl had been alone in the woods for days, and the bear, her protector, her silent guardian, had been leading her to them. Sarah's grip on Lily's hand tightened. "And you think these men are coming for you?" Lily nodded, her gaze flicking to the door. "They always do." A shiver crawled up Daniel's spine. The wind picked up outside, rattling the window panes. Somewhere in the distance, the low, guttural growl of the bear rumbled through the trees. It wasn't a warning. It was a promise. Daniel pushed himself up from the table, his body moving before his mind had even caught up. He strode toward the window, eyes scanning the edge of the forest, searching for something, anything, that felt out of place. For now, nothing moved beyond the trees. But the air felt charged, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Sarah's voice was tight. "Daniel, what do we do?" He turned back to them. Lily sat stiffly in her chair, the oatmeal half-eaten in front of her, her small body tense. Sarah stood beside her, her protective instincts fully awakened, her hands resting on the girl's shoulders as if she could shield her from whatever was out there. Daniel clenched his jaw. "First things first. Lily, do you remember anything about the men?" He knelt beside her, keeping his voice as calm as he could. What they looked like, what they were wearing. Lily hesitated, then nodded slowly. "Black jackets, with a patch." Daniel's stomach twisted. What kind of patch? She furrowed her brow, trying to remember. Then, with slow, careful movements, she traced a rough shape onto the wooden table with her fingertip. A circle with a smaller shape inside it. A symbol. Daniel's breath came sharp through his nose. He had seen something like that before. Years ago, a memory stirred, but before he could grasp it, the sound of tires crunching over gravel echoed in the distance. His blood ran cold. He was moving before he even processed it, striding toward the front door, rifle in hand. The familiar weight of the weapon steadied him, but it didn't erase the dread curling in his gut. Sarah's voice followed him. Daniel? He reached the front window and froze. Headlights, cutting through the trees, bouncing along the dirt road that led up to their cabin. 2 vehicles, black trucks. A shadow flickered at the edge of the clearing. The bear, watching, waiting. Its massive form stood at the tree line, its presence an unspoken warning. Daniel turned back to Sarah, his voice sharp, urgent. Take Lily, go to the back room. Lock the door. Sarah paled. Daniel, now. The night air was crisp, the kind that carried a stillness so deep it almost felt sacred. The trees surrounding the cabin stood tall and motionless, their dark silhouettes forming an impenetrable wall against the moonlit sky. Somewhere in the distance, an owl let out a solitary call, its haunting echo the only sign of life in the frozen wilderness. Daniel Carter sat inside, the glow of the fireplace flickering across his worn face. He had always found comfort in the solitude of the mountains. The city had been too noisy, too fast, too full of ghosts he didn't want to confront. Out here, in the deep wilderness, time felt suspended. He spent his days tending to his land, chopping firewood, reading old books, and listening to the wind weave its endless stories through the pines. He took a slow sip of whiskey, savoring the warmth that spread through his chest. It had been a long time since anything unexpected happened in his quiet corner of the world. Then came the sound, a deep, heavy thud against his porch. Daniel tensed, setting his glass down. He wasn't the type to get spooked easily. Years of living alone had taught him that every sound had an explanation. But this was different. It wasn't the scurry of a raccoon or the soft pad of a deer. It was heavier, deliberate. He reached for his flashlight and moved toward the window, careful not to disturb the curtains too much. The sight outside made his breath hitch. A bear, a massive grizzly, standing at the edge of his porch, illuminated in the moonlight. Its thick fur was damp with the remnants of melting snow, its powerful frame rising and falling with each heavy breath. But Daniel barely had time to process its presence before his eyes were drawn downward, to the small, unmoving shape at its feet. A cub. It lay limp on the porch, its small chest barely rising. The bear nudged it gently with its snout, letting out a low, guttural sound that made Daniel's stomach tighten. What the hell was he witnessing? Bears didn't do this. They didn't bring their young to humans. They didn't ask for help. And yet, that's exactly what this looked like. The mother bear nudged the cub again, then lifted its head to look at Daniel's window. For a moment, their eyes met. There was no aggression, no challenge. Just something else. Something Daniel couldn't quite name. A plea. He took a step back, gripping the edge of the counter. His mind raced. This could be a trap. An animal's instincts were unpredictable. But the cub was hurt, and the mother wasn't leaving. He exhaled sharply. God damn it. He muttered under his breath. With slow, careful movements, he unlatched the door and stepped onto the porch. The cold air bit at his skin, and the scent of pine and damp earth filled his lungs. The mother bear stiffened but didn't move. He could see the cub better now. Its fur was matted with dried blood, its tiny body barely stirring. Deep claw marks ran along its flank, a clear sign that something had attacked it. Daniel crouched down, keeping his eyes on the mother. His every instinct screamed that this was a mistake, that at any moment, she could decide he was too close. But she didn't move. I don't know what you expect me to do, he murmured, voice barely above a whisper. But if I help, you can't kill me for it. He reached out, hesitated, then carefully lifted the cub into his arms. It was warm, but barely. Its tiny heartbeat thudded weakly against his fingers. The mother bear let out a deep exhale, a sound that almost felt like relief. Daniel backed up slowly, cradling the small body against his chest. He stepped inside and shut the door. Inside, the air felt warmer, safer, but his pulse didn't slow. He laid the cub on the worn couch and grabbed his first aid kit, hands moving on instinct. Years ago, before he left his career behind, he had worked in wildlife rehabilitation. He had treated wounded deer, birds, even the occasional bear cub. But he had always worked in controlled environments, never like this. He cleaned the wounds carefully, wincing as the cub let out a weak cry. It was young, too young to be on its own, maybe only a few months old. Outside, the mother bear sat, unmoving, watching through the window. Daniel could feel the weight of her gaze as he worked. He wasn't sure if it was fear, desperation, or something else keeping her rooted there. As he wrapped the last bandage, the cub stirred slightly, its tiny paws twitching. "That's it," he whispered. "You're okay." He sat back, running a hand through his graying hair. Outside, the wind had picked up, carrying with it a sound that sent a chill down his spine. A howl, low and drawn out, distant but unmistakable. Not a wolf, something else. Daniel's jaw clenched. He had been around long enough to recognize the kind of silence that followed a predator's presence. The woods had gone still. Even the mother bear's ears were pricked. Something else was out there, and it wasn't done hunting. Daniel's pulse quickened as the howl faded into the night, swallowed by the silence that followed. It wasn't the cry of a lone wolf marking its territory. No, this was different, lower, stretched too long, filled with something predatory. It wasn't a call. It was a warning. Outside, the mother bear stiffened. Her massive form, already imposing, seemed to grow taller under the glow of the moonlight. Her ears flicked forward, nostrils flaring as she sniffed the air. Then, a deep rumble rolled from her chest, a sound so primal that the hairs on Daniel's arms stood on end. She smelled something, and she didn't like it. Daniel swallowed hard. He turned back to the cub, which lay wrapped in a blanket on his couch, its tiny body shivering despite the warmth of the fire. Its breathing was steady now, though still shallow. It wouldn't survive another attack. The mother bear took a step toward the door.